Good day, everybody. From wherever you're joining us, welcome. My name is Bob Bordone, and I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School, the founder, former director of Harvard Law School's Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and one of the founders and a principal at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. I'm joined today by my colleague, Krista DeBoer, who's my co-founder and has very kindly agreed to take on the thankless role of being the Zoom pilot for today. For those of you who are new to CNI, we are actually a relatively new initiative. Our purpose is several-fold: to offer valuable courses that we have been doing virtually and are now starting to do in person on negotiation, conflict resilience, leadership, and challenging conversations. But we're also really committed to building a community of practitioners, scholars, teachers, and others who are really interested in advancing and building the field of negotiation, leadership, and conflict resilience, hoping to learn with and from each other, all with an intention to make a positive difference in the world. So to this end, we offer various panels and sometimes one-on-one interviews that we like to do virtually monthly, where we bring experts, people with really rich experience together to share and to learn around a particular topic. We will today be recording the session, which we will post to the Cambridge Negotiation Institute's website, and we will also post it to our YouTube channel, which we invite you to follow. And today we're really excited, deeply honored that we have guests from actually 19 US states and 15 different countries, from Australia to Austria, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, India, Ireland, Israel, Netherlands, Pakistan, Peru, Spain, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and of course, the United States. And that's because we have a really special roundtable today. And it's the first of two that we're doing on this topic of the future of people-to-people peace building in Israel and Palestine. The second one, which we'll say more about later, will feature youth voices and will be on August 4th. And in fact, some of the young leaders who are going to be on that panel are joining us today. So thanks for joining us. Just to kind of put a little context to this, as many of the people on this call know, over the past 15 plus years, people-to-people peace building organizations in Israel and Palestine have really faced growing and enormous challenges. The unrelenting expansion of Israeli settlements, increasing restrictions on the movement of Palestinians, the lack of Western leadership, the inability and lack of will of political leadership in both Palestine and Israel to meaningfully move the peace process forward, are just a few of the realities that have made the work of peace-building organizations ever more difficult and at times, I think, disheartening. But at the same time, these dire developments have also prompted this field, this community, to work collaboratively to identify new strategies and approaches to both the what and the how of the work that they do. And of course, recent events in the region have created an ever more intense urgency to the reckoning that has consumed this field for many years. So I think this is a moment where the people-to-people peace-building movement finds itself at a critical inflection point, with many looming questions about what its work should be, what the moment calls for, and arguably even its relevance. So to provide context and perspective on this question, we have this incredible assembly of world-class panelists who are joining to offer their insights, their experience, their research, and their wisdom. Our panelists have agreed that rather than waste limited time with extended introductions, I will just briefly introduce each right before they speak. We will be posting a link into the chat where you can learn more about their bios. Each of the panelists have agreed to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes and have empowered me in various ways to let them know if they've gone beyond that, which I will do. After the panelists speak, we'll have a time where they can ask some questions of each other, and then we will have questions from you. There are two ways you can ask questions. We've set up the chat that you can privately chat me as the host. Alternately, we'll ask people to just use the raise hand function and actually have them ask their question to everybody. I may have said that I did say this is being recorded, so just so that people do know it is being recorded. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first panelist, who is Professor Eileen Babbitt. Eileen is a professor of international conflict management at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She is a noted scholar and practitioner with a long-term affiliation at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. She is deeply rooted in practice, having worked for more than 3 decades as a facilitator, trainer, and mediation specialist around the world, including in the Middle East. So Eileen, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Hi, everybody. Nice to virtually see you. I want to preface my remarks with just a brief addition to the bio that you have been given. I have worked with a specific type of people-to-people connection, which is track 2. Track 2 has a very particular profile. It's meant to bring together influential members of communities in conflict, to create both rehumanizing interactions, build relationships, but also create the possibilities for these influential members of these communities to think differently about steps forward and possible solutions. So it has a very particular purpose, which may be different from other sorts of people-to-people encounters. So I'm speaking from that vantage point. Also to say that specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian context, I worked for about 15 years in Israeli-Palestinian track 2, primarily just before and following the Oslo agreements and up till the Second Intifada. And a lot of that time working with Professor Herbert Kellman, who some of you know, and employing the methodology that he created, which is the interactive problem-solving model. After the Second Intifada, my work shifted to working with Arab and Jewish communities within Israel itself in various guises. So again, those are informing the comments that I'm going to make. So in terms of track 2 work in people-to-people connections between Israel and Palestine, I think it's not a good time for that kind of work to be taking place. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that the issues facing the two communities now are much more structural than they are relational, in my view. And a track 2 process is really not set up to directly address those structural problems. And by structural, I mean the extensive power asymmetry between the two communities, the continued occupation in the West Bank, and expansion of settlements. And in addition, a bit of uncertainty about the leadership in each of these two communities, the new coalition government in Israel still being tested, and the unfortunate canceling of the elections on the Palestinian side, which raises the question, and I'm interested to hear how others would interpret this, about the continuing legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership, not to mention the ongoing disjuncture between Hamas and the PLO. So it doesn't seem a good moment or a productive moment to engage in track 2 explicit Israeli-Palestinian conversations about managing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That said, I think there may be other options for track 2 work in particular. One is the Arab-Jewish relations within Israel itself. And I know this is also very delicate at the moment because of the the active participation of the Arab citizens of Israel in the latest confrontation and a sort of consolidating, I would imagine, of the Palestinian identity across all these different divides. So it may also be difficult for Palestinians in Israel to engage. But my own experience working with that community is that there are tremendous resources to be mobilized there, really wonderful and intelligent and committed people. And I think, again, lovely to hear from the rest of you, others on the Jewish side also interested in engaging, and hopefully in the wake of changes in the Israeli polity, a little bit more flexibility for those on the Jewish side interested to engage, to have more voice and take more leadership. I also wonder about track 2 work within the Jewish community and within the Palestinian community. Certainly there are tremendous divisions and challenges within each of these communities. I'm not sure this is a role for outsiders to play. I mean, this is who I am. And so, you know, for me, I'm not sure this is an appropriate place for me to be working. But those of you who are members of those communities, I'd be interested to hear what kinds of work is already going on. And whether the within community conversation could be supported and encouraged and magnified, amplified somehow. Lastly, a lot of the writing that I've done and thinking I've done in the last 10 years is about the relationship between human rights and conflict resolution, and human rights and track 2. And this, of course, has opened up the bigger question of justice and peace and how they interact, and getting beyond the rhetoric that says they're combined and we have to do both, et cetera, et cetera. The Israeli-Palestinian context, both within Israel and with the occupied territories and with Gaza, et cetera, is a particularly difficult place to think about how to do that. But I'm more and more convinced that this is an explicit situation where justice requires, I mean, peace requires justice. I don't think there's any doubt, at least in my mind, and I think in the minds of many, and I think that is becoming more and more obvious. It's upsetting to think that it's taken this long for it to be so explicitly obvious to this larger international community, and what that means for the peace building work. I think that's a wonderful conversation for us to have. But I don't think it's something we sidestep and work around. I think it's something we have to address explicitly. And if there's an advocacy piece to it, I think we need to embrace it and not avoid it.
Eileen, thank you so much for kicking us off and for raising this really important question that I'm sure we're going to be digging in more on, which is the challenge of advocacy and also bringing people together in dialogue, and what does that look like in this moment. And you know, this also really urging of us to realize that peace does require justice, and what does that actually look like and mean on the ground. So thank you for getting us started with some really good questions. I'm now going to turn to my friend and colleague Joyce Edgeluni, who is the General Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee. She is a Palestinian American who also served as the director of the Ramallah Friends School in Palestine before agreeing to lead the AFSC in 2017. She has a really distinguished career in international development in Palestine, and we are super excited and honored to welcome her today. Joyce.
Thank you.
Joyce, I inadvertently muted you because I was trying to mute myself. Sorry.
I thought, like, what's going on? Okay. So thank you, Bob, for the warm welcome and for including me here. Yeah, the honor is mine. I love engaging. And again, what informs my remarks today is indeed my lived experiences as a child born in Jerusalem, raised in Ramallah, a mother living under occupation, and a third generation Quaker. Quakers believe that there's that of God and or goodness in everyone, and that we need to seek it all the time. And so I believe, I really truly believe in the power of dialogue and engagement to transform hearts and minds. I have been on both ends of that transformation through my many engagements with Israelis, many who have become my friends. During the U.S. Brokered Palestine-Israel negotiations in the early 1990s, that was pre-Oslo, there was a confidence building period that was put in place. And as a result, dialogue groups between Palestinians and Israelis were established. And I was in my early 20s and I joined one of them, and Israelis and Palestinians would make home visits and talk about their lives, their families, their history, stories, hopes, fears. It was so nice to meet my neighbors who were for once not in uniform. And we freely, and while we couldn't completely remove the power asymmetry amongst us, but we knew that for the first time for decades, a negotiation process was ongoing and that peace was in the air. And I hold on to that feeling. It was a matter of time. It's coming. And so that I was, recently married, and I thought, what a wonderful place to raise my children when peace is in the air. And I chose to stay there and not to bring my family here to the US because of that. So that gave way for a genuine reconciliation mood, so to speak, to surface. It felt good to be heard. And it was critical for me to relate to the other, my new peaceful neighbors. I felt it had merit. And however, we know where all of that went, and I won't get into it, but, people to people programs, they aim through provisions of shared interest to bring people of both sides together, to reconcile, humanize each other, reduce their prejudices for one another. In the conflict resolution world, these are successful in post-conflict environments, or at least when peace is in the air. This is certainly where we are not today. And I agree with you, Eileen. I agree that this is not the time. So today, following decades of people to people work, we are where we are. Occupation remains, settler colonial land grabs remains, ethnic cleansing remains, killing of children remains, a protracted violence remains. So several studies have analyzed the impact of such activities. Many deemed them weak in demonstrating strategic impact. But do these interactions have the potential of changing attitudes on a personal level? Of course they do. But attitudinal change of a selected few alone will not lead to systemic change, especially with no mechanism in place that influences decision makers. So what do I do with my changed attitudes? Just my changed attitudes. Like, how do I move it into that influencing stage? And my son, he experienced one such interaction at the age of 15. So over almost 15 years ago, he's almost 30. He came back from camp distraught. He named it at this young age. He felt uneasy about being in a space that made no mention or accounted for the disparity of power in the room. For all he knew, the so-called friend that he was playing trust building games with will one day soon, maybe in just 3 years, be turning him away at the checkpoint or bombarding his town. How problematic is that? So through the program activities, he was also given the responsibility of convincing his oppressors that he is actually oppressed. Think of it. Think of it giving Black kids the responsibility of convincing their white classmates that slavery and Jim Crow were real and oppressive, and that the strife around white supremacy and racism is merely a conflict between Blacks and whites that requires reconciliation and mutual understanding efforts. Systemic racism is not a conflict. Occupation and settler colonialization is not a conflict that is mitigated through textbook conflict resolution tactics. We need to first start reckoning with the historic injustice and ending systemic oppression. These attempts at reconciliation, while colonization and military occupation is ongoing, are very damaging. Such initiatives insinuate and assume a real peace process is in the works, a farce in itself, as we know, and neglect the realities and struggles on the ground. They send the distorted message of this conflict will end if we just got along, so let's play soccer together. Focusing our energies and resources on the superficial get to know the other initiatives instead of solving the structural causes of the struggle is damaging. People to people projects release Israel from being held accountable under international law. I need to repeat, this is not a conflict between two equal sides, but one between an occupier, a nuclear powerhouse, a settler colonizer, and Palestinians who have been dispossessed in 1948 by the creation of the State of Israel, and again in 97 and in 67, and continue to persevere and struggle for survival and freedom under daily infringements of their rights and attempts at their ethnic cleansing every day. So my last point is a fundamental one. I want to affirm it. So Palestinians have lived through decades of a wide assortment of peace-building initiatives. You name it, we've tried it, right? We've spent time, resources, engaging people to people, dialogue groups, confidence building, economic incentives and economic collaborations. And a lay person in the streets of Gaza or Hebron can provide you a very sound analysis of all the above, of what could move us forward and what would harm prospects for peace today. The response, I'm guessing, would be simple: end occupation first. We have become an encyclopedia for the peace-building world, with case studies galore on all sorts of initiatives. Yet, very few want to consider our narrative. In fact, many are offended by our stance or attempt to disqualify our analysis as illegitimate or absurd. I see that with the anti-normalization position that Palestinians took nearly unanimously. We chose that as our political stand and tactic that fights back against whitewashing of Israeli human rights violations and puts front and center the root cause of the struggle. We believe that peace-building efforts can't proceed on the community level without power parity. Think South Africa. Peace and reconciliation efforts took off after the collapse of the apartheid regime, when both Blacks and whites had supposedly equal access to political power, rights, and resources. This is where we stand. Yet the US government chose another path through the Middle East Partnership and Peace Act that advocates of this act engage tens of organizations. Most, if not all, are Zionist entities, and hardly any Palestinian organizations were consulted. So again, our narrative is excluded, we are excluded, as others design solutions to our struggle. At American Friends Service Committee, where I work, we work around the globe, always being led by communities, we say. We remind ourselves of that every day. Those oppressed have the solutions. They know what they want and how to achieve it. We are mere facilitators, so they can succeed in defending their own power to determine their own fate. So here again, we, Palestinians, we have spoken. End the injustice first and normalize relations second. It's a simple message. It is patronizing and indeed colonial as an approach for advocates to try to persuade Palestinians on the value of such community peace-building initiatives. They should not be subject to debate. Organizations, policymakers, peace advocates need to center the Palestinian voice. We've written books, studies, policy documents, articles, blogs. For the advocates for peace, I plead, read them, decolonize your approach. We need our allies and our partners in peace to lift our narrative instead of swaying us to accept theirs. As such, I urge the people-to-people community to pivot, to address accountability, and adopt a solidarity frame. Thank you.
Grace, thank you so much. And you've raised so many good questions with your very strong arguments. So we will definitely be getting to them. And I'm really grateful that you're here. And thanks for sharing this perspective. I'm now going to turn to Ned Lazarus, who I met many years ago at the Program on Negotiation, and learned that we had many shared interests, including a longstanding affiliation with Seeds of Peace. Ned is now an associate professor of international affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School. He's an expert in conflict resolution and has written extensively on the long-term impact of peace education participation. He is extremely generous because he's joining us from his vacation right now in Juneau, Alaska. So Ned, I will turn it over to you. And Ned, please guide me how you would like me to share the slides as we do this.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob, for inviting me to join this distinguished panel and for convening this critical and timely conversation. Thank you to Eileen and Joyce for your heartfelt and very important remarks, and likewise to my fellow panelists. And Bob, you can, I'll let you know about slides. We might just start with one there, the conversation is critical and timely. It's also, as Joyce reminded us and Eileen reminded us, a conversation that has been ongoing for more than a generation now. Myself, I have actually, as of right now, been part of it for 25 years. I began working in Jerusalem with Seeds of Peace in 1996 and continued that through the Second Intifada through 2004, and thereafter through research, through teaching, and primarily through evaluation of peace-building initiatives and trying to understand some of the very important critiques that have been brought forward as well. So I will do my best to condense reflections from 25 years into 7 to 10 minutes as instructed, but feel free to keep me to time, of course. So I like to start for a second with this image here. To me, it embodies a lot about peace building, and also the idea of peace building or working across conflict in a time when the conflict is not close to resolution, when peace is not in the air. So this is a school in the town of Kfar Qara, which is Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. It is an Arab town in Israel in the north. And this school is one of a network of the hand-in-hand schools, Arab and Jewish integrated bilingual schools. I took this photo while doing an evaluation there. And I find it poignant because those of you that can read Hebrew or Arabic can see what this quote is. It's Gandhi's famous quote: "We must be the change we want to see in the world." And to me, this says a tremendous amount. This community of people are saying we are not going to wait for the world to embody what we want, the kind of relations that we want, the kind of equality that we want, the kind of connections that we want, the kind of education we want for our children. We are going to build it now. We're going to try to be, even within the very painful context in which we live, we're going to try to embody the change in the society that we would like to build. We're not going to wait. We need to do it now. We need to create possibilities that will bring that closer. It's particularly poignant, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, so this is one of, I believe, now 7 campuses. This network has grown in recent years in different places in Israel that belong to this to the Integrated Bilingual Schools Network. But it is unique at this school. This is the only place in all of Israel where hundreds of Jewish students go to school every day in an Arab city. And so I find this campus, in a sense, particularly a particularly powerful embodiment of that. I also really find the quote valuable because we often get hung up on this question of peace or justice, as if these were mutually exclusive things, when in fact, I would believe that the vast majority of Israelis and Palestinians, the vast majority of us, want both, and see that they are very clearly interrelated. So rather than getting stuck on peace or justice, which of course also mean different things to different people, this quote focuses on change. Be the change you want to see in the world. John Paul Lederach, who is the guru of conflict transformation, of peacebuilding, says that the key to transformation is a continual focus on change. What has changed as a result of this work? What is different in the societal landscape because people decided to take risks, to challenge norms, and to work together across divisions? What has been added to the conflict environment? What has been built that did not exist before? Are there new resources? Are there new networks? Are there new possibilities that can help to gradually transform conflict from destructive to constructive? So I'm often asked, does peacebuilding work? That's, of course, the right question in many ways, certainly to ask an evaluator, but it's not specific enough, because there is not one answer for all peacebuilding initiatives of all kinds at all times in all places. I have seen many peacebuilding attempts that have successfully contributed to meaningful changes, whether at the personal level or, in more rare but very important cases, at the communal or larger societal level. I have also seen others that failed to reach their objectives or to implement their programs. I have seen unintended consequences, both positive and negative. And often I have seen the best organizations learn from failure and challenge and adapt. And they constantly need to do that. And today is another time that that will need to be done. We know that marriage only succeeds 50% of the time, that 90% of tech startups fail, that the greatest hitters in baseball succeed at their job about 30% of the time. So I don't have a percentage for peacebuilding, because peacebuilding is itself such a diverse umbrella of different initiatives. I think the important thing that I feel after surveying this for many years is that it can work, that it has and often does work. And what I mean by work is creating resources for conflict transformation, creating potential, greater potential for change. So Bob, if you can go ahead to the next slide. Just to let you know where I'm basing my reflections on. So I've done a number of evaluations of peacebuilding, specifically in Israel, Palestine. My doctoral dissertation was a long-term study of the impact of peacebuilding participation among the first 10 years of Israeli and Palestinian participants. So tracing how many of them remained engaged in any form of joint work or peace building from adolescence through adulthood. And for that cohort, specifically as the peace process collapsed and was replaced by the Second Intifada. I followed that up with a number of evaluations, and these were evaluations not really of specific projects, but of actual funding mechanisms that were funding many different kinds of work on the ground. So I did this for USAID in 2013, for the EU Partnership for Peace, and for the US Institute of Peace, and finally looked at a comparative case, which was the funding of peace building in Northern Ireland. I've just received a 2-minute warning. So as you can see, I'm failing at getting 25 years into 10 minutes. Bob, if you can advance the slide, I think one of the most important things to note is that this field is much more diverse than it is often given credit for. There's not one type of peace building. There's not one people to people. There are many different ways in which Israelis and Palestinians, Arabs and Jews in Israel work together to change the conditions of the conflict. The field is methodologically diverse. It's adaptive. It is always embattled. It faces many critiques. And it is, we can also say after 25 years, in which the occupation tragically has become entrenched and the conflict more intractable, this field is resilient. In a 2017 report, I found 164 different active organizations in the field, and that's an undercount. That's a minimum. There are numerous veteran organizations that have endured, evolved, and grown through crisis after crisis for decades. My last visit to the country was in 2019, the 70th anniversary of Givat Haviva, a campus in the north of Israel that has worked to advance equality and shared society between Palestinian and Jewish citizens for decades. It is critical to see the diversity and the evolution in the field. The 164 organizations I listed are doing wildly different things, diverse strategies. You can see some of these here. Classic approaches such as advocacy, culture, dialogue, education, protest, track 2. And also growing numbers of projects integrating peace building with practical fields such as environmental protection, scientific research, health medicine, and high tech, among many others. More important, the organizations themselves are dynamic and different, even if they're using the same strategy. Neve Shalom, Wahat Salam, on the one hand, and Roots on the other hand, both do dialogue, but they do it very differently. They reach different participant groups, different political views, and they have different approaches to facilitation, and that is good. In these societies, which are so diverse, politically, ethnically, religiously, and every other way, diverse approaches are necessary. It is both and not either or. I'd also like to say that the veteran organizations that have continued have adapted and changed and evolved. They are not doing the same thing today that they were 25 years ago, nor they should be. So I will end this part, and I'm glad to talk more about specific examples later on, but just say that I think it's very important not to generalize about people to people or peace building as if it were all the same thing, when in fact it is a dynamic, diverse, and evolving field that needs to continue to listen to critiques and adapt.
Ned, thank you, and I'm so sorry for being the time police. But
I'm sorry for going on too long.
No, you're fine. I feel like I have like a bad role in all this. But I do want to make sure we save time for conversation amongst all of you, and so that is one of the roles I'm playing here. So thank you, Ned, for getting us started, and we'll obviously be coming back to this. But for now, I'm going to introduce Lior Amahai, who is the executive director of Yesh Din, which is an Israeli human rights organization that monitors, researches, and conducts legal and public advocacy with the goal of enhancing access to justice for Palestinians on the West Bank. Before joining Yesh Din, Lior headed Peace Now Settlement Watch Project, and he also, many years ago, was a camper at Seeds of Peace. Lior, thank you so much for joining us today, or this evening for you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, and all the speakers before me, and humbled to participate in this panel. Unlike the other panelists, I've never researched this issue. It's true, I'm the director of Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights organization that deals with the occupied territories of Palestinians living under the occupation, trying to improve human rights and end the occupation. And it's true, as a teenager, I was a participant in the Seeds of Peace camp. And my undergraduate I did in London in a wonderful program that it's closed since, named the Olive Tree Program led by the late Professor Rosemary Hollis, who even wrote a book on this issue called Surviving the Story, which I recommend to all those who are researching and interested in this issue. So for me, I will speak from my personal experience of people to people and some reflections that I have sort of did over the years with my experience and watching other groups in the area. So there are common features that I saw or that I see in many people to people groups, to name a few. One, that many Palestinian participants anticipate and join these groups because of belief that if Israelis will listen and understand, then perhaps reality will change. And reality does not change, not for the better, for sure. And this creates great frustration for its participants. Israelis often who participate in these programs are frustrated during the process, however, will often feel less racist during it or at the end of it, and thus will feel better about themselves in both cases. So here too, reality in the outside does not really change for the better. Some participants, Israelis and Palestinians, may actually only reinforce their existing beliefs and stigma, creating, and if that's the case, or when that happens, that's a bad effect of the people-to-people work. And finally, I'll say that many participants, if not all participants, risk being alienated from their societies. They harm their careers or potentially harm their careers, if not worse. It may also harm their ability to reach leadership positions. I recall one Israeli member of parliament who was also part of the Olive Tree program that I participated in, and she literally had to hide her background in order to be legitimate in the Israeli elections. So people to people is a risky business and needs to be done carefully, and those who participate, to my view, are courageous and brave. I also think that peace people to people is not and should not be about ending the occupation, the siege, the decolonization, whatsoever. If these are the goals, then they are what should be addressed and targeted. And if one argues that people to people is a means to achieve these goals, then I think one should consider the costs, the heavy financial costs, the burdens, how much these programs cost. And considering the past 30 years, it's hard to make this argument that people to people lead to the end of the occupation, siege, and whatsoever. Now, I think that many people to people groups who prefer to focus on personal and cultural similarities, trying to promote mutual understanding, and that do not discuss national identity or Palestinian experience, these groups especially, or groups that target joint projects and do not address power relations. And there are also groups that focus on narrative in place and suggest that there are unequal settings or terms. These programs may also cause harm and frustration to the participants. But for me, the most worrisome is the political landscape, and Joyce, I think, reflected this in her words. I work in the field of human rights. I work in Yesh Din, human rights organization. Last year, we made a legal analysis, not a political opinion, not an op-ed, not a provocation, that in the West Bank, the crime of apartheid is being committed. Just yesterday, we published figures on Israeli military investigations to the Palestinian casualties who participated in the protests on the Gazan border, if you remember 2018. The data is frustrating. The military only investigated those soldiers, all the Palestinians who were killed, not one investigation to the thousands of Palestinians injured. There's only one indictment, and even that is a very minor indictment. So the message here is that if one wants to deal with a main issue, then accountability comes to mind. There are much more important and significant issues to the lives of the Palestinians and also to the Israelis that are at stake. But having said all of this, I do recommend participating in people-to-people groups, at least some of them. I do hope that my children will go to the hand-in-hand schools that Ned mentioned, and I think he mentioned them for a reason. They do provide much hope and they do good. And I think for the individual, there are positive outcomes and that they could possibly shape their identity or one's identity in a dramatic fashion. If groups focus on the differences that distinguish Israelis and Palestinians as identity groups and do not relinquish the inequality and the outside powers and the political context, such as Wahat al-Salam Neve Shalom, the School of Peace there, then I think that this is a real positive possibility for positive change and to do good on society, or at least to a certain degree. From my personal experience, this kind of work that Wahat al-Salam did, that I was privileged to undergo, enables the individual to hold broader perspectives, to learn about group dynamics, to learn how to listen, to argue, to debate, to not to be so threatened by different opinions. It teaches patience, listening, to containing and controlling oneself, and possibly sometimes even feeling empowered. It enables to hold parallel, if not conflicting narratives at the same time. It benefits, the benefits affects the forms of in other relationships, in personal relationships, in work relationships. Participants may also increase their understanding of the conflict without undermining their commitment to their national identity. And I'll also add that participants recognize their national narratives recognize how their national narratives enshrine their identities and how it justifies group behavior, which may cause to reconsider their personal options. So at large, I feel very privileged to have undergone people-to-people work. It helps, I believe it helps my work, my role as a director in a complex organization, an Israeli human rights organization that deals with Palestinian human rights, that holds Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian staff, and that hopes to end the occupation and improve human rights in a political climate that works against us. However, my main message would to encourage governments and political groups to deal and focus with policy and accountability and international law. And certainly if people-to-people come at the expense of these, and it often seems that in the global context, it's much easier to deal with people-to-people. Let's just get these people together. It's much easier to do that, it's seemingly, than to hold accountability. That's it. Thank you.
Lior, thank you so much for, again, raising this question that I really hope we can dig into, this question around the kind of systemic priorities, but then what may be the benefits of people-to-people on individual lives. And also, I hope we'll be able to talk about, this theme that I've heard come up a lot and that Joyce mentioned, which is this kind of the cost or burden that sometimes one group might be asked or expected to bear as part of that kind of educational process. So there's a lot in there. Thank you, Lior. I'm going to turn now to our very last panelist, Huda Abu Arkoub, who is at the Alliance for Mideast Peace, where she is the very first on-the-ground regional director. She is joining us from the West Bank. She's been a lifelong leader in people-to-people diplomacy. She's traveled the world speaking, teaching, and consulting on these issues. And so we are really honored that we have been able to grab some of your time, Huda, today. Thank you or this evening for you. Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it, Bob, for the opportunity. I want to add to my CV that I am the spoiling auntie of 33 nieces and nephews, that I am in this work because of them. And I do believe in this work, not because of the cliches about it. It's just 20 Palestinians and 20 Israelis in one room and recognizing each other and, behaving well, etc. this is old thinking, and we are beyond it, at least in the times that I have joined here. I see more and more Palestinians who are strongly attached to their identity, asking for a more comprehensive sense of identity that is fragmented by Oslo and the geography that fragmented us. I see many Palestinians who believe that maybe we should move beyond the two-state solution. And this is something that our track one leaders are not even thinking about it, because this is the project that they were brought to protect. But our young Palestinians are rethinking that. Also, I see many Palestinians moving from the position language to needs language. And when you are living here on the ground, and I live in Hebron, and everyone, when the mentioning of Hebron itself is going to bring a lot of images to your brains, you who are listening to me, that this is a very, very dreadful place to live in. And it's true, but it's also a very resilient place. And it's all because of the youth in Hebron, in Palestine, and the women, that I will not take for granted the fact that some of them are bereaved and still want to find a way out of this dreadful cycle of violence. I also acknowledge the fact that there is a lot of funding that was directed towards taming the shrew, which is making the Palestinians less violent, and not thinking of a whole militarized community, Israel, that is violent by training. Many of the programs also never address the structural violence that is part of the problem. But I have to say that in our programs, at least the ones that I worked with or for or monitored, this is not part of the conversation. There is no attempt whatsoever to tame one side over the other, or to claim that the two sides are equal. What I see as a result of some of these programs that are not just one shot, they are now more developed to have follow-up and continue working with alumni. We have an alumni leadership forum that our youth are thinking of advocacy as a way of doing co-resistance, citizens diplomacy. They are standing with Sheikh Jarrah people right now, and they are willing not to be featured on media so as to protect Sheikh Jarrah from being named as a normalizer. They are in Gaza, and they are on the borders of Gaza. They are tackling issues that has to do with religion, as part of the problem. How about having religion as part of the solution? Why God is the problem? Could be us the problem. And we have also people who are thinking that maybe the two-state solution is not a solution, but what would be the solution? And looking at models that worked in other contexts. No one of the Palestinian participants that I've worked with, especially women, have given up on her sense of identity and pride, the pride that comes with it, or even compromised on giving up on Safad at some point. They've never thought of sending their kids to throw stones, but they couldn't stop their kids from defending their mothers. Mothers are holy in Palestine, and when we are accused of teaching hate to our kids, I tell people to go to checkpoints and see what our children go through, and what, as mothers, I am not a mother. I chose not to be a mother. Again, I am a spoiling auntie. When I spend some time with my nieces and nephews and the kind of humiliation they experience on a daily basis, knowing that the one who is responsible for it is the structural violence that comes with the occupation, all I can do is to get them to stop feeling victim and taking some responsibility in order to change that dynamics. And then they feel the power. Everyone out there in the world wants the Palestinians to continue claiming that victimhood. I think we are not. We are victims of structures around us, but we are the most resilient. And the community of peace building, trust building has moved beyond contact theory. we're rethinking the language. We're naming the work as co-resistance, Palestinians and Israelis co-resisting injustice everywhere. We're standing by each other when it comes to women's issues, youth issues, prisoners, everywhere. We're partnering with human rights organizations. We're doing advocacy on track 1 and track 2. We are, even when we are giving up on track 1, we are still believing that this is one way to do resistance. And I am for comprehensive way of doing resistance, but I am also against anyone who names one particular community that is the most resilient and most fragile, but also the most creative, as the ones who are going to whitewash the Israeli narrative. Unfortunately, this is one of the reasons why many of us are, I'm speaking to you now, and I cannot even mention some of the Palestinian dynamics because I am under questioning now because of the work that I'm doing. We live in a very dangerous environment. We have the Israeli security on us. We have the walls, we have the permits, we have the checkpoints, and we also have the Palestinian security forces that is feeling very, very fragile at the moment and feeling that one day maybe we will be a replacement, and this is not in our agenda at all. And I want to put a question for everyone on the table here. Let's pretend that people to people is, and I refrain from using it as using the term people to people. To me, it's co-resistance. Let's imagine that these programs do not exist. And, just Olme took the initiative and did a poll on youth attitudes on both sides, which is something that very few organizations or structures have even thought about it. And it's too dangerous even to share with the world. But it's informing us on how to do programs in a way that kids will not leave confused, kids will not leave thinking that they should be the tamed ones, but working together in order to end all forms of injustice. I am passionate about the work because I live and breathe it. It's the reason why I existed until now. It's the reason why I did my master's degree in peacebuilding and conflict transformation. And John Paul Lederach is one of the people who taught me. But I see John Paul Lederachs and I see Gandhis in women in Palestine on daily basis. And I see it also in Israel. And I want that to be the culture. I want that to be the future of the Palestinians and the Israelis who both have rights and should be treated equally and should call for justice for all. I appreciate you giving me the time. Thank you. And I'm hoping that we will have some more challenging questions. So for us to continue to change for the better.
Huda, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of the panelists. So what I want to do now is before we take some questions, I actually just would like to invite any of the panelists, if they have an additional remark or a question for one of their co-panelists, I want to just invite them to do that. And then I will open it up more broadly. By the way, for those of you who are watching, if you go to watching this for speaker, all the panels have been highlighted, or you could watch everybody. So any other additions or questions that you'd like to offer? Yeah, Joyce, please, and then Ned.
Yeah, I have a question to Ned and Lior, because they both mentioned Nabi Shalom, Wahid al-Salam, which is a project that I've been following endlessly, and I'm a fan of that work. But realizing that that work really is happening inside Israel proper, and not on in the occupied territories. And I'm curious, because that is a space for coexistence and where young adults come together and coexist. But I'm curious, since these are not there are no such similar projects on the occupied territories, and they will probably not be for a long time. How that your analysis is different when it comes to the work beyond Israel proper, because I just noticed that you honed in there, and that is really a different dynamic altogether, because two peoples enjoy similar rights, supposedly.
Thanks, Joyce. Do Lior or Ned, do one of you have a thought or a reaction on that?
Sure. First, Neve Shalom Wachat Salam is one, it's one of multiple programs, but I think maybe one reason is that they developed a facilitation methodology that's very specifically coming out of critiques of asymmetric power relations, and it's focused on emphasizing collective identity, basically on not allowing participants to sort of make nice and avoid the elephants in the room, and further than that, and also to recognize the asymmetry of power, whether they've practiced that both with Palestinians from the occupied territories and Israeli Jews, or with Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israeli Jews. And they've been doing that for a long time, and they've also adapted their methodology. And when you build a resource, when you build like a training school, so they have the School for Peace, they train facilitators, that then can go and influence all kinds of other. So Neve Shalom Wachat Salam trained facilitators, became facilitators at Seeds of Peace, became facilitators at other places, and brought that critical approach. And then that helped those organizations begin to change and develop their perspective as well. So I do think that's one reason why it's a pivotal place in that regard. But there are many, and it's important to note that. I think your point is crucial, and I think it's maybe one of the things about our discussion today. The differences between people-to-people work with Palestinian citizens and Jewish citizens in Israel versus Palestinians in the occupied territories, and even, as Huda mentioned, the fragmentation difference, working with Jerusalemites. There's a ton of people-to-people work now in Jerusalem, which I think is actually important. But again, that's between, it's less of a stark, it's still very stark, but it's less so than for people in the West Bank, and then especially obviously from Gaza. So I think that is one of the things that this work needs to consider all the time. I do think that probably when we're talking about the West Bank and places where the conditions can be quite severe, work should focus on specifically changing conditions. So there's very important joint work in environment, in energy, in other fields where it's a very clear interest that is shared, or a shared problem, and the changes that can be brought about, increased water allocation, increased resources for desalination, increased things like that, where people-to-people groups like Echo Peace or the Arava Institute are able to do that, then I think that's doing work that's meaningful for Palestinians living under occupation in this time. But I do think that you're correct. It's not that all forms of this make sense at all times. They need to be very careful about how that's chosen.
Ned, let me just see, Lior, would you like to add something to this?
I think Ned said it nicely. Very briefly, the only reason I mentioned Neve Shalom Wachat Salam is because I think that they've got it right, or the best method that I've seen so far, putting the national identities at the forefront, and understanding that we are representatives of our societies, and what goes outside reflects what happens in the room. And I share their analysis, and I also see it when I sort of work in an organization that has both Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinians. I share their lens of analyzing the group dynamics.
Great. So I'm highly aware of the limit of our time and the fact that there are a number of questions coming in. So are people who would like to ask a question. So I want to ask Joel. Yeah, Joel, your hand's up. Joel already asked me, wanted to say something. So Joel, I'll call on you. Thanks so much for being here, Joel. And I think many of you on this call know who Joel is. So Joel, please, do we need to unmute you or?
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fab. Thanks for all the panelists. I have a question for all of them and then just a very brief comment, just a factual correction. But my question to the panelists is, while recognizing the asymmetry of the power dynamic, which is stark, how do we also deal with the symmetry of fear and mistrust? Because it's equally as stark, that we have this challenge of an asymmetry of power, but a symmetry of fear and mistrust. And so how do you even begin to unpack that? Because that, for me, is the central problem of an abandonment of peace building. Because it's very attractive to move to a pressure thesis, where we just pressure one side and just hope that they get it. But as long as the fear and mistrust is that high, I just don't think it's going to happen. But my factual correction, just quickly, Bob, and I know we're short on time. Joyce, I wrote the Partnership for Peace Act. It's the head of AllMet. I advocated for it. Huda can also walk you through how it went. It's just not true what you said in terms of that people weren't consulted. I'm happy to offline with you about what that is, but I'm not willing to allow that to be said in an esteemed group without that being corrected. And I'd also say the impact of MEPA, which is its acronym, as important as it is on the ground, it is revolutionary that passed Congress. In terms of, if you look at what congressional stances are towards Palestinians, between the Taylor Force Act, between the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, and the fact that that passed in a bipartisan fashion under Donald Trump at that time. So I would really, really like, not here because it's not, but can we please not, as a community as a whole, demonstrably attack each other for bad faith without full facts? I just think it's very harmful, not just here I don't care, but there, the advocates who advocated for it there. This stuff reverberates. So I'll just pause there and have to offline on that as well.
Thanks, Joel. I appreciate that. And I definitely would invite the offline, but would love to hear any thoughts that any of you have on this question of the symmetry of the lack of trust, the symmetry of the distrust, and how to address that. Eileen.
Yeah. So yes, and the 25 or 30 years of track 2 work was addressing that symmetry of trust and distrust and fear. And it hasn't changed anything, Joel. It hasn't changed the system. We thought it would. I mean, I believe in track 2 work. I've been doing it as long as anyone on this call. I believe in what Ned said about it changing attitudes, and what Leor said about humanizing and the importance of all of that. I believe it completely. And it hasn't changed the situation on the ground. So more of the same is not going to work. More conversation about the shared fears and the shared mistrust, in my humble opinion, it hasn't worked for 25 years or 30 years to change the dynamics of the system on the ground. So we need to do something else.
Yeah, great. Ned, do you want to say something on that?
I wanted to say that when we say it hasn't changed, there are two things about that. First, it
hasn't changed the structure, Ned.
First, right, but that isn't necessarily the kind of change that it can directly impact. When we talk about change, we should be specific, and we should look at examples where change can happen, where it does happen, where it has happened, because that is empowering for people to see that that's possible in an intractable reality in which the structure changes, is very resilient and very hard to change. It's important to build up resources that can contribute to that and build up the desire for that change, which is the main impediment to change. The other thing about it is we all have to be honest. It's a straw man argument. Everything else has been done also. Human rights organizations, Palestinian advocacy organizations, everything else has existed for all of this time as well. There is no lack of those. There never has been. And nothing has changed in the way that you've said from that work either. And I would say on both counts, because I personally believe that these are enormously valuable and important and necessary reflections of people living in this conflict. I think that the problem on both counts is not that what they've been doing, but that there isn't enough, that they are too small, that they are not brought to scale, that their voices are not amplified. What I think is unfortunate, and I don't fully understand it, is the idea that this is either or. I don't get it. Good peace building work will get many more people to listen to the horrible situation of human rights and the need to change the reality for Palestinians.
Ned, thank you. I'm so aware of the time. I am going to call on one more person who wrote me early on, who is a SEED graduate. So Aviv, if you can unmute yourself, and I'll maybe just ask you to be brief with your question, and then maybe we'll be brief with the response.
Yeah, hi everyone. Glad to be here. I have a question for Joyce. When you mentioned that the first step should be about ending the occupation and ending the military presence in the occupied territories, and then peace or peaceful progress, if we can say that. I'm wondering what if you can see the point of view of security reasons why Israel, and especially with not so stable and or trusted by the people government or authority that the Palestinians have, how do you think that the Israeli government and society should trust the PLO and just remove all security measures to ensure that no terror attacks will occur within the lines? Yeah.
Great.
And
Thanks.
sorry if my connection is bad.
No,
sorry if my connection is bad.
You came across. We heard you. And Joyce, do you have a thought or reaction to that?
Sure. Well, it's the same question about trust, and we are, I think I haven't heard of any community in the world that is living under oppression and occupation asked to build trust with its occupier and its oppressor. And so that is, to me, a really bizarre ask, that we are living under the gun and we are being asked to build trust with those who are oppressing us. I mean, that is really bizarre. And we have seen the Palestinian peace builders. You have seen Israel make peace with recently UAE, with the Muslim world, and yet not with the Palestinians. So to me, it is really a distorted ask. What can you do, those of you under oppression, those of you under the gun, what can you do to prove that you are trustworthy and good partners for peace? I refuse that. I refuse that vehemently, because we should not have to prove that to anybody. And I think that I remember starkly when I was in Ramallah when living there when Oslo happened and Israeli soldiers left our city. And I remember the convoy, and I remember our neighbors going down and giving them candy and saying, "Go in peace." And there was smiles on the soldiers' faces, friendly smiles as they were leaving. The Palestinians are peaceful people, and I do not want to tarnish that because of acts of resistance that to me went astray, and I don't condone them in any way or form. But people have a right to resist, and we need to be clear on that. peacefully as a Quaker, non-violently. I believe that's the way. But I refuse that narrative that we need to prove that we are peace builders. I think that is not fair.
Thanks, Joyce. This is, of all of these events that we've had, it feels most painful to me to have to stop on time, because this has raised so many really hard questions, and just, I think in many ways underscores the enormity of the task of, this question in some sense that I think Ned asks, but all of you are asking, right? Like, what might it look like to both work for justice and advance peace? What might it be to find ways that we can learn from each other, but also address systemic issues? So I just want to thank all of you panelists. Usually I put in a plug for various events we're doing. I'm not going to do that now, except to say on August 4th, we are inviting some young people who I think will probably share some of the views that are expressed here, but will have, I think, a really different lens because they are the next generation. No offense to the people on this panel, but I hope for those of you who have found some of this that raises some questions, that you will join us on August 4th to hear what these young people say. For now, thanks to each of the panels for being here. Thanks to all of you. There are many familiar faces as well. I'm really grateful that you're here. Stay safe and well, and we will see you again soon. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Bob.
Thank you, Kristen, Bob. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.